and welcome to our Bridges to Community podcast. My name is Sarah Turcotte, and I'm an area community liaison for Bridges by Epic.
And I'm Erica Lab, Director of Team Member Engagement and Culture for Epic Senior Living. Happy New Year, Sarah. Great to be with you.
It's great to be back here in the studio, my friend.
We are so excited today to be talking about dry January. And it doesn't just have to be January. It could be sober October or abstinence April, but we're psyched to talk about this really timely topic. And we have an expert with us. Dr. Marisa Silveri is a neuroscientist and director of the Developmental Laboratory on Addictions and Mental Health at McLean Hospital and an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She has been conducting preclinical and clinical research for over 25 years in the areas of brain development, addiction, and mental health. Dr. Silveri has been continually funded to conduct research by the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, a branch of the National Institutes of Health since 2004. Not that you're old enough to be doing that work, but Dr. Silveri is the recipient of several awards from the Research Society on Alcohol and Research and Mentoring Awards from McLean Hospital and Harvard University. She has authored over 85 peer-reviewed scientific publications and counting. Dr. Silveri has been committed to public outreach for over 2 decades. She speaks extensively to communities on adolescent brain development, addiction, mental health, with over 150 talks given to date. We'll say 151 as of today. Dr. Silveri completed a mental health counseling degree in 2023, as if she hadn't done enough. And in addition to her research, she works with teens and parents as a mental health counselor at the Arlington Youth Counseling Center. And full disclosure, I am lucky enough to call Marisa Silveri one of my closest friends, my nearest and dearest. And I'm so happy to be with 2 of my favorite people to talk about alcohol.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. It's always fun to talk about research. It's interesting to talk about what is on the minds of people when it comes to alcohol use, people's own alcohol use. And of course, a lot of my work is around teenage brain development. And for better or for worse, all adults have been teenagers at one point. So, everything is kind of relevant. So
some of us still act like teenagers. So, well, we're so happy.
Always a kid at heart. Always a kid at heart. No, and I'm thrilled to have you here because I do think that this topic is something that we're seeing and hearing people talk more about. So as Erica shared, I think it's relevant to it being dry January, but really thrilled to just learn and share your expertise around this topic. I would love for audience members just to kind of learn and maybe understand where did your passion come from? Like what brought you or drove you into this field?
Well, a lot of researchers conduct what we like to call me-search. So, on some level, people are interested for a whole host of reasons. But, I've always been interested in biology, and I, in particular, have been just very interested in the biology of the brain. So when I was an undergraduate student at Union College, I took what would today be called neuroscience, but then was called Intro to Psychobiology. And the moment I started learning all of these amazing facts about the biology of the brain and what kind of governs our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings, I was hooked. And so, I went through a very interesting time course in terms of development, and I loved research. I loved data, statistics. And so I thought, how could I best serve the world? At the time when I was just a young undergraduate, I was like, I can't help people. That'll be too hard. I'm an empath at heart. And so, I went into a research lab. I worked with Linda Spear at the University of Binghamton in upstate New York. Amazing neurodevelopmental expert, a pioneer in the field about alcohol effects on the brain. And after that, I made this transition to work with humans. Animal research is important in many, many ways. It helps us answer questions that we can't ethically do, especially when it comes to the impact of alcohol on the adolescent brain. And so I, packed up my bags and moved out to Boston for a postdoc in the imaging center at McLean Hospital. And one of the first projects was to study people who were heroin addicts on methadone maintenance using brain imaging. So it was a world away from the research that I had been doing on the bench.
Sure.
But the goal was really to get to using a technology like MRI, which is non-invasive, to have a window into the teenage brain. because it's one thing to, study adults when they're impacted by, whether it's mental health issues or substance use, both. Some of the work was really pointing in the early 2000s to what can we learn about the brain before anything happens. Sure. And so it's really been a fantastic opportunity to have a window in a non-invasive way into teenage brains to help identify risk for later addiction, later mental health issues, both. And along the way, I just really have enjoyed teaching and community outreach. I'm very passionate. That's a big passion of mine. And then somewhere a year into COVID, I had this dream that I wanted to go back and get a clinical degree so that I could sit one-on-one with teens and parents and help them navigate in a more, direct way. And so
so cool.
I've tied all of the pieces together. I've been at the bench. I've done clinical human research using imaging. And now I also am a practicing clinician, which has been a lot of angles to consider all at once. So I feel very fortunate to have had the path that I've had.
I think what makes you really unique is that you're science-minded, right? Research-minded. You love the data. But then when you speak to groups of youth and their parents, like, you make it really digestible and fun and funny and human, which I think is hard for, like, we're marrying, like, things we can do. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about today. Like, what can we do for better health with the data and the research and the stuff that's happening in the laboratory. So it's digestible for, like, Sarah and I and our friends and family when we want to talk about the importance of, like, a dry January or examining our drinking, things like that. So I think you've done that so well.
Thank you. It's really, sometimes I refer to myself as a neuroscience interpreter. So I can read the science, I can pull out the points, and it's complicated some ways because it's such sophisticated work that you never want to not give the scientists their credit for all the work they've done. But to your point, our job as scientists is also to make it digestible for the public so that we could help people, hopefully improve their lives. It hurts to be human. And that has been the theme of the research of my lab, is that, part of our job is to help teenagers feel better in their skin. And if we think about it, life is hard. I mean, Pink says it best. It hurts to be human. And if we can find even small ways to live a more comfortable life where we're not looking to substances or other coping mechanisms that might not be the healthiest, that's really kind of the goal.
Yeah, I love that.
Especially in today's day and age.
That's for sure. And I think it's timely that Surgeon General recently came out with finally a statement about, the cancer-causing properties of alcohol and alcohol use. So even more timely for this discussion.
Exactly. Sure. And I would love to kind of jump in because I know with the topic being dry January, I'd kind of like to start by just asking, how can you explain to folks, how does participating in dry January influence long-term alcohol consumption habits?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most notable things about Dry January is that if people decide to sign on and, undergo this challenge, it really helps people pause and take a look at what their habits are. And so, I did a Dry January a number of years ago now, and I went through a period of 500 days where I didn't drink. And it was during the pandemic. And part of my rationale was that, while this is my day job, I think about alcohol all the time. I think about it in my professional life. I think that I've had a healthy relationship with alcohol in my personal life. I'm a single mom of 2 kids and I work several jobs. So how can we maximize how we feel? And so, the short answer is that any reduction in drinking is considered an improvement. But I think what Dry January does is it really gives people the personal feedback that, wow, this feels really hard. Or these are the particular places. Like when I go to make dinner at night, I really would love a glass of wine while I'm cooking. Guess what? You could be sober for 500 days or more. Those cravings don't necessarily go away because we've developed these behavioral patterns. But even one night of not drinking can have improvements on our sleep, a whole number of functions of our body. So, there's the short term, which builds to the long term. Sleep, of course, is probably one of the biggest improvements that you see. Even decision making around what foods you decide to consume are influenced. When you're under the influence, you have a tendency to reach more for the salt and the sugar and the
pizza,
the burgers, all the things. So there's a whole host of things. But in the moment our brains no longer have alcohol on board, the brain already starts to adapt. And I think that's what's a really fascinating feature of alcohol. I mean, other substances does it too, but alcohol works in a way that's very general across the entire brain and body.
Sure.
And interestingly, the piece with sleep, we've talked a lot with dementia care. We talk a lot, a lot of data now is really highly associating quality sleep with wellness overall, but especially for our folks that we talk to a lot about, preventative measures for dementia, right? And then the other point that you make that I really like about the dry January or dry whatever month it is that you're going to try this, or one night, is the mindfulness around, why do I like this glass of wine with my meal prep? And everybody probably has a different reason. And there's no right or wrong, but it's like the actual mindfulness around something that we've created this habit. Every night I pour the glass, I don't even think about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think, too, people oftentimes don't realize when they're feeling these cravings. And I think about you mentioning, the COVID and the pandemic. I think many, people and families, maybe had an issue with people over consuming just simply because of the stress level of the times. And I think, one thing you shared is, and maybe you can answer this, is what are some of the psychological effects on successfully completing a dry January or dry month or dry period of time? What do you see in that having an effect on someone's stress level?
Well, we can think about this in many different ways, but one immediate thought is that anytime you set a goal for yourself, it kind of gives you that executive functioning control over, I'm going to set a goal and I'm going to try to meet my goal. And for every day you meet the goal, there are a whole host of apps you can use. I've used a Dry January app from the UK, which is one of the original places where it was founded. And every day it sends a message. Did you stay dry today? And sometimes, I'm actually doing Dry January right now, I will look at the message or the notification that comes up. I'm like, well, yes, I did. Click.
Yeah.
And all of that little surge of reward in my brain feels amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But then, so when I first did Dry January, I was on a Peloton alcohol-free group. There were people that were all doing the same thing. And, when people would slip, there would just be such shame and, just feeling so bad about themselves. So you kind of have to be gentle with yourself. I think to speak to the mindfulness, acceptance commitment therapy is it's a very up and coming way to think about the fact that we need to accept ourselves. And listen, if I mess up, it's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Because then people say, well, I ruined it the first day. I'm going to go on a binge right now.
Glug. Yeah.
Exactly. But if you're like, you know what? I wasn't perfect, but I cut my drinking down this month in half.
Right.
That makes a big difference.
You celebrate the gains.
Yes. In terms of psychological effects, I mean, a lot of people will reach for alcohol if they're feeling depressed or they're feeling anxious. And in the immediate, when you first take a drink, what alcohol does pharmacologically is it boosts the brain chemicals that actually make you feel better. But guess what? They are so short-lived that the moment alcohol goes out of your system, those brain chemicals will go back to that same neurobiological profile of feeling sad and anxious, and then they actually overshoot. They actually feel worse. People talk about, the anxiety. So when you're hungover, the anxiety you feel, that's because your neurochemicals have adapted to alcohol being there. Then when alcohol leaves your system, the chemicals adapt to alcohol not being there, but they overshoot. It's like you're running a race. You can't just stop at the finish line. You have to run over it a little bit. So it's kind of the same idea. So even though we're coping with depression or anxiety, alcohol is going to help me calm my brain down so I could go to sleep. Well, alcohol is a sedative. It might help you feel relaxed, but actually the impact it has physiologically is way more profound. If you ever tracked your heart rate during night, so I'm a Fitbit enthusiast, and one of my, I've been a neuroscientist for decades now. I've collected my own data for decades now, and if I have a cocktail in the evening and I look at my heart rate in the middle of the night, you see, here it is. This big, huge peak. And that's what contributes to, we think it's helping us sleep better.
Yeah, it's
actually,
opposite.
It's the opposite. It has a big impact. And I think when people see their own data too, it's kind of like, ooh, so then why do I keep doing it?
Yeah, right. That's the question. And and you and I have talked extensively. I had done a Dry January back at the beginning of the before the pandemic that we knew of was starting. So I was in the midst of I had said, oh, this 30 days felt really good. I'm going to keep going. So I was sort of in the middle of this dry period when COVID hit. And then people were drinking more. And I was like, well, maybe I should just stick with this a little while, and ended up doing a longer period. What it allowed for me was to feel the things that the alcohol had been sort of numbing for me. And so I found that the peaks and valleys over time, like it was really hard at first, but those peaks and valleys came down to like just a more static, or I don't even know the word, but like everything was just a little more even for me, rather than these like peaks of anxiety or hangxiety at 2 a.m. and what am I so worried about, to just sort of more stabilize. But it took a little while.
Sure. I mean, it does take time for the brain to adapt, for your behavior to adapt. You know, you could do something for a month and you're going to get insight into what your behavior is. It takes, up to 90 days to actually make a behavioral change.
Right.
And sometimes it's hard to stick with it. And so I think for some people who, if they slip, they're like, back on it. But all of that works together. And, to your point, and I think it's so important, is that you do feel more when you are not covering it up with a substance.
Right. And that's where a lot of the work comes, is like that. Now what? If you're going to, whether you're going to abstain completely forever, or you're going to go back to mindful drinking, or just go back to drinking, like what are some tools I can use for my own health that I learned from that dry spell? Oh, I found that I coped really well when I took a walk when I had heart feelings. So rather than reaching for the drink next time, I might try a walk first, or something, that's I know is a little bit healthier for me to cope with feelings.
And I think, too, just to, have people try to remind themselves that, if you've had a bad day or you've had a slip up when you're trying something like this, that it's just a day. You don't have to say, I'm going to wait till next week to start over, or wait till next month to start over. It's just, you had a bad day, you shake it off and move forward from there.
Totally.
And, I'm listening to you both, and I've heard you mention that, when you are participating with something like this, some of the health benefits are, maybe better sleep, better heart rate. Are there other, physical things that people experience? Can you share more about those kind of physical benefits that people experience with this?
Sure. I mean, inflammation is another big one. So, if you feel kind of puffy and sore and your joints hurt a little bit, we know that alcohol does cause inflammation, and that takes time to recover as well. If you're drinking alcohol, you're probably not as well hydrated. But again, alcohol impacts all the major organs in the body. So we talked about sleep. We know that alcohol has a clear effect on the heart and, your physiologic function in many ways. So there's an immediate recovery as well. Things like the lungs. When, if you had to do a breathalyzer, that's because our lungs are highly vascularized. And when you drink, you get alcohol breath because alcohol settles there and you breathe it out.
I never knew that.
I didn't know that either.
The lungs are one of the most highly vascularized parts of our bodies.
That makes
and
sense.
so when you drink, it spreads. Think about it. A liquid through your bloodstream is just going everywhere. And, I'm not surprised about, people have also reported, they lose weight, because they're eating better. They're, like I said, they're feeling less inflammation, maybe less arthritic. Is it a cure-all to quit drinking? But we do know that there's been a lot of myths along the way. I just having my glass of red wine every day for my heart. That's kind of been debunked a little bit. Anything that's not supposed to be in the body, I mean, think about it. If we don't have alcohol in our system and you add something in, then our body has to go to work managing what's going through our body. It's not surprising. There have been decades of research showing links between alcohol and cancer risk.
Right.
And so why is this information coming now? I think people are finally being able to, maybe more clearly show the risks. We're seeing a higher incidence of cancer, particularly in young people. So to the extent that that's maybe linked to alcohol could be a big piece of it. And so something like, again, Dry January is so timely because there are increased risks. And will it make a difference if someone picks up a can of beer and they see that there is a cancer risk there? Is that really going to change their behavior? It's a question.
Yeah.
But we do know that, the Surgeon General is making a statement that, listen, there really is an impact. With regard to women who, might drink during pregnancy, we know that there is never a safe time for a woman who is pregnant to drink. But we also have to think about all the shame and stigma that can come with all of these different pieces. So if you're a pregnant mom and you drank, and, how do we manage all the emotions that are surrounding it? So a lot of different places that we could improve our physiology from head to toe. People report that their hair gets better, gets softer, less dried out. It also opens up space to do things like more walks or more exercise.
Sure. And your wallet, it affects your wallet.
Oh, for
too.
sure. I mean, that's what, the app, the UK app is really great because it gives you an idea of units of drinks, how much you saved, how many calories you've saved. It's just a really nice way to be like, what happens if I do record this for a little bit?
Especially if you're data driven. Like a lot of us like
Data-driven.
that. We have our little Fitbits or whatever, and we're like driven by that. I think one of the arguments made for that one glass a day and is the social aspect of it. And I know, I'm a couple of years into my sober journey because of a couple of dry Januaries. I was like, this feels pretty good. And I've stuck with it because I just feel better. And the data showed me I feel better and I am better. So I've decided to cut it out. But that social piece is there's something about hey, cheers, and this celebration with a glass of champagne or a glass of red wine. And I really had to be okay, can I be social without it? Am I sort of a wet blanket because I'm not drinking? And that took a lot of work for me because for 33 years, I was the party guy, I know you guys can both relate, you're the fun one. And I know that because I've hung out with you guys. And that was hard for me is does that change my personality? Can I still be fun without it? And it's hard. And that a lot of that process. And so the validation of alcohol for social or one glass is good for you is that's a lot of undoing of this machine of information that we've gotten all these years.
Or just lifelong habit of this is how you're used to socializing. And I'm sure that's probably a big barrier for many people trying to get through something like dry January. I mean, I would love for you to maybe give a little bit more insight on what Erica just shared and maybe any other barriers that people might face trying to do something like this.
Sure. I mean, the barriers are real. I still think you're fun.
Yeah,
yes,
that drink.
110 on that.
This is a super fun person to begin with, and it's not about the drinking.
I don't have to go back.
Part of it has to do with
water, just for the record.
Part of it has to do with having a support system. And so, my support system started with just a Facebook group that people were kind of talking to each other. And for me, too, I was also observing when people would feel like they had a slip, how people were responding to them. And, you find support groups who really lift you up and they help you. But there's always the person who will give you a hard time about, come on, just have a drink. How are you not drinking? Mm-hmm. And there is, almost like a bully nature about it. And it's interesting because, it's my opinion that those folks are probably thinking indirectly about their own drinking. And well, if you're not drinking, don't make me take a look at what my drinking is. And so finding the right support system is really, really important in all the ways. And going to parties or going to situations where that there's going to be an alternative. So before the pandemic, even there's been this big sober curious movement. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of very, there's a great book, the person who wrote Sober Curious. It's an excellent read. There are people that are really focused on how do we make mocktails? How do we make alcohol-free drinks? I also appreciate that, increasingly you go to a liquor store or a store, there are a lot of alcohol-free options. Mm-hmm. But even the smallest changes of calling something alcohol-free instead of non-alcoholic, think about what stigma that removes from it. Mm-hmm. Hey, guess what? If I'm going to have a party and we all want to toast, then, here's all these fancy cocktails I made, and here's a table with some red Solo cups and some soda. How can you dress things up? There are a lot of There are a lot of bars that have opened up in New York City and other major cities that are alcohol-free bars because people still want to have the social piece.
Right.
Exactly.
And part of the work is really about the stigma and the support. If there's someone who's making you feel really bad, or they are one of your biggest people that are going to push you towards relapse or risk for that, then you kind of have to rethink that a little bit.
Take a break.
Yeah. But the Sober Curious movement has really gotten a lot of traction from a harm avoidance perspective. What does 1 month of abstinence do? Is it enough? It's a start. Absolutely. You might do it again. You have to be mindful. And many people will think, well, there's a lot of funny jokes out there about like dry January and, drunk February or whatever it's going to be. But being mindful of that, to be like, okay, February 1, I'm going to be at risk for not going back into my habits. And
harder.
It might take several, it might take several Januaries or months to kind of go through it. But again, support group. And there are social people who want to be social without drinking also, or not having that be a main part of it.
And I think, too, if this is something that someone is doing, for a long time investment and it is difficult to get started, I think also for these support, partners or families or friends to realize that it might be difficult for this person to immerse themselves into, outings or situations that they were doing. It might take time to find a new way of enjoying these social opportunities, because I think that can be tough, too. I've had friends or family members who have gone through this, and they'll say, oh, they can't hang out with us because they don't drink anymore. And it's not that. It's that it could be a trigger for them, and having that understanding and creating spaces and opportunities for people to have a little bit more of a comfort level to join in.
Yeah, I love that. Giving them some time.
Yeah.
I had a friend that invited me to sober yoga, and we were like, as opposed to drunk yoga, but it felt like this safe space to go and have some time in a place, and you didn't have to be like a sober person to go, but it was like people that were being mindful about their drinking, and it was like, oh, this is a great space. It felt social, and you had something in common from the beginning. Doesn't mean you're sober, but you were thinking about your drinking, and that was a nice place to be in community, rather than the bar where it's a little more triggering for people early in sobriety.
I mean, this topic has been going so well. I can't even believe that we're getting close to our time with you. And I would just love to, before we wrap things up, is just ask, we've talked about a lot of great outcomes and reasons why we should practice something like dry January. Is there any information or anything that you wanted to share with the audience before we part ways today?
Oh, so many things. The first thing that I did want to mention is also for parents who have kid eyes watching. I think it's important. Yeah, it was
all of us.
Yeah.
All of us. Yeah.
During the pandemic, it was hard because kids were watching their parents drink and be distressed, and parents were like, "Well, my kid's home and safe and not driving. I'm going to let them try drinking." I mean, one of the most important statistics is the younger you are when you start drinking, the greater the likelihood of an addiction later in life. And so the message for kids is the longer you can delay the onset of first use, that is your best success about reducing addiction later in life. So, if you start at age 13, there's about a 47% chance that there will be an alcohol use disorder or issues with alcohol later in life.
Wow.
If you wait until 18, it's about 17%. Even if you wait for the legal age, 21 in the United States, to start drinking, there's still a 9% chance. So a lot of people will say, well, what about Europe? They're all fine there. Much higher rates of alcohol use disorder in their youth.
Which is why the whole Sober Curious thing started, really was there because of right?
Yeah, well, part of it was, let's really try to understand what these risks are and how do we, really help kids think about, not never, you might have a relationship with alcohol someday, but, if at the kid's 2-year-old birthday party, if it's really all about drinks for the parents, kids are aware, and there's so much in social media that they're seeing anyway. And so
they're sponges.
Parents are actually one of the strongest protective factors for kids. Having a no tolerance policy to be like, whether it's, it's not legal or your brain is still doing the most important development. So if I had to end with one thing, the things that we do to our brains, the first decade of life, obviously vulnerable, learning to do the things. The second decade of life, the period of adolescence, has one of the biggest impacts on that longevity of life. And so thinking about the entire lifespan, there's been a lot of data coming out lately, especially women in their middle age drinking and their increased risk for things like Alzheimer's and dementia. You know, there are hormones on board that also kind of figure into that. So I almost think about it like, you know, my kids would never like this idea, but like, can I just put a helmet on my kids during the entire second decade of life? Because some of the things we can't appreciate is that you could live a whole life, but if your memory doesn't work anymore and your cognition is not functioning, then what is that life? We're really great at fixing knees or replacing other body parts. We as neuroscientists have not made many advances in terms of how do we keep the brain young.
But that's something as parents of tweens we can do.
Absolutely.
Right there. Help them to wait.
And it's something that we also see on our end of the spectrum working in the field of dementia care, and we are seeing more alcohol-related dementia come to the table.
For
so
sure.
You're absolutely 100%.
Well, and people living longer lives, they're drinking longer into their older years. And so, you know, again, it's really hard to be an alcohol researcher and someone who's enjoyed drinking. I'm not here to like ruin the party or be the downer about all of it. But no matter what, alcohol does not discriminate. It doesn't matter who you are, how old you are. It's going to change how your cells in your entire body work for the period of time that it's in there.
Right.
The longer you do it, the bigger the impact. And guess what? Once you stop, this is probably a really important moment of hope for people, is that we have tons of data that if you stop drinking, if you go through abstinence, your brain actually does recover. And I think that's the hope. We could use brain imaging to show that your brain chemistry improves, your brain structure could, you know, kind of come back a little more bountiful. And so if you slip, the quicker you can stop. If kids have already started drinking, the quicker they could stop. You know, it's all about preservation, particularly the parts of the brain, the frontal lobe, which runs the show, in the hippocampus, the memory center, which, what are we without our memory? So those are the two most vulnerable parts of the brain, frontal lobe, last part of the brain to come online, and they're also the first parts of the brain to go. So, you know, having a healthy relationship, not exceeding the daily limit of one per, you know, if you're biologically female, 1 drink per week or 1 drink per day per week. If you're biologically male, 2 drinks. We have a lot of other questions. What about other, you know, gender identity, how all sorts of other things kind of play into this message that we're given. If you're female or male, there's so much more to it.
Yeah, so much more.
And do a whole nother
podcast. Let's
I'll
do
come
it
back again.
Yeah, we would love to have you back.
Maybe we could do part 2, because this definitely has been a fruitful conversation, and I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to share your expertise and knowledge. It's truly been a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, to be with both of you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
What a great
part of my job as a scientist is to spread the word and get the information out there just to help people, you know, have life just feel a little easier for a moment.
Well, this has been great. I think we'll
the
probably
great work
motivate.
you do. And thank you for joining. And I do hope that you'll join us again on our next Bridges to Community podcast. Thank you so much.
See you soon, everyone.
Thank you.